Welcome once again to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel. It's good to talk to you again.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me.
Always good to hear the latest of what's going on in the Middle East and Ukraine and elsewhere. Of course, it was in Europe this past week, last number of days, where the news has been focused on the tragedies in Paris. But, you know, it's supposed to be all about free speech, right? It was supposed to be an attack on our liberties and our free speech. And yet you point out in an article that you wrote on January 14th that just a couple of days afterwards, France is cracking down on free speech. Could you explain to our listeners what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the famous saying by Rahm Emanuel that you can never let a good crisis go to waste, you know. But, you know, yeah, I'm sure all of your listeners saw the scene of all of these world leaders lining up to march down the street in Paris in support of free speech and the ability to speak even controversial thoughts and all of these sorts of things. What's funny, I don't know if you saw this, Jay, we had a picture on our site, but there was an aerial shot of this group, and you know they wanted it to look like they were part of this mass rally of millions of people. It turns out it was just a relatively small group of political leaders who were all gathered together, and they were all jockeying to be in the very front. The Israeli press even made fun of their Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was elbowing some poor African fellow so that he could be in the front of the line. So they all wanted to be photographed supporting free speech. And of course, the first hypocrisy was that to the person, every foreign leader who participated in the march were the most egregious violators of free speech, that you can imagine. You know, back home, you know, people like the Israelis, the Netanyahu. You know, they've killed many journalists. South Africans have done the same. There have been, there are people in France in jail for free speech. So these are the serial violators of free speech who went and marched for free speech. So it just shows you what the state thinks of us. Thinks that we're stupid. But the point you made, Jay, was that so just 3 days after France made this big show of celebrating free speech and freedom of expression, they sent out their police forces to arrest more than 50 people in France for exercising free speech. And it was no doubt offensive speech. I'm not familiar with the individual cases, but apparently anyone who spoke out in favor of the people who'd made the attack and anyone who made any anti-Semitic statements were arrested, and they faced charges of between 4 and 7 years in prison for making these statements. So it's a pretty serious offense. But the irony, of course, is that, while neither of us endorse either of those sorts of things, people that say the terrorists are good or people that make anti-Semitic comments, the point is, here you are saying that free speech is great when a magazine that made its living making extremely graphic and horrible anti-Islamic and anti-Christian remarks and has the support of the state. So the irony is just so thick, it's incredible.
Yeah, anti-Jewish too, I think. I think it was an anti-deist publication, an atheistic publication, and they're certainly free to say those things. I would defend their right to do that. But on the other hand, if you inflame people, it's understandable. I'm not justifying anything that these terrorists have done. But they shouldn't, and we should be free to say what we believe. I think that is a God-given right, but at the same time, it's the hypocrisy of it. I guess we're free, Daniel, as long as we don't say anything that is offensive to the ruling elite, to the people that are in power, the status quo.
Exactly. Well, the funny thing is, even the Pope, I think yesterday or something, got into a bit of controversy because, while he said essentially what you said, people should be able to say what they want. He said, but something on the order of, but if someone came up to me and insulted my mother, and then he laughed and said, you might just get a bop in the nose.
Yeah, I mean, that's a natural human trait, and if the Pope himself would admit to that impulse, it's it's understandable.
Yeah.
that it's natural to happen. But at the same time, the hypocrisy of it all. I mean, the thing is that the problem is that if you're not allowed to speak out and question your government, then you're just destined to tyranny, it seems to me, Daniel. And that's why the free speech idea was what was supposed to help safeguard our liberty. But as I think we talked about it a little bit last week, I'm not so convinced we're that free to speak here. I think you're free to speak as long as you don't become as long as your news media isn't too large or too threatening, then they'll let you say what they want, whatever you want to say, and you can say anything. And that's why, I mean, I keep going back to that example of your boss and also the socialist senator now and representative at that time, Bernie Sanders, both giving Greenspan a hard time. And Chairman Oxley was apologizing for the behavior of your boss and the Congressman Sanders. And Greenspan says, well, but that's what makes us so great, that we are we condone and we honor free speech, and that's what makes America different. Well, maybe we're not putting people in jail yet. I don't know if we are or not for saying things that are offensive. I hope not. Well, but at the same time, I think, Daniel, there's a reason why some of the ideas that are expressed at the Ron Paul Institute are not expressed on the major media very often anyway.
Sure, I think you're right, but we are very close, and I think people are in jail for their speech. If you look at someone like John Kiriakou, who I think we've talked about before, Jay, he was the CIA employee who blew the whistle on torture.
That's right.
He's the only person to go to jail over the torture issue.
Right.
The person who actually blew the whistle.
Yeah, the guys that are torturing and doing things that would be against humanity and against all international law previously are running free, and that's fine. Yeah, and they're being promoted within the CIA, I suppose.
And look at the case of James Risen, the New York Times journalist who very courageously pursued a story of CIA operations against Iran, and he was repeatedly threatened with jail and very, very narrowly escaped jail.
Right.
The government demanded that he hand over his sources, and as it came out, Condoleezza Rice personally intervened with the New York Times to keep them from printing his work.
Wow.
So that's talk about limiting the free press and the free speech. That's
right.
That's getting awfully close there as well.
Right here in the United States, and of course then there's Edward Snowden too, who for all practical purposes is in jail. He's chosen to stay in Russia, and I don't blame him a bit. I think I would do the same thing. And those of us that think Snowden was a hero for exposing wrongdoings by our government, I suppose that those of us who say that might have to look over our shoulders too one day.
Sure, absolutely. And so it's anyway, the hypocrisy of these horrible, the French government is among the worst. They routinely jail people for speech, and as a matter of fact, this is they passed it. They had a new directive to their police that would allow for these people who are picked up, these 50 people to be picked up, to be sentenced immediately. Special measures
without a court trial.
Yeah, just throw them in jail
without a court trial.
And one of them was actually a very well-known, controversial French comedian who's had his shows banned by the French government for a number of years, because the French government considers his jokes to be anti-Semitic, and he's been prevented from performing by the government. And he tweeted, I think on his Facebook page, he wrote something that made fun of the French rally for this free speech rally, and for making fun of it, he was arrested.
Wow. So much for free speech. Well, I guess the French, ever since the French Revolution, have been very much against the church and religion and so forth. So I suppose the publication that has suffered these travesties probably were considered to be in good taste to rag on Islam and Christianity and perhaps Judaism as well. So as long as you get rid of God, it's no problem, I guess. You get rid of God in the minds of hearts and people, then that's cool. You can say anything inflammatory you want, but just don't rock the boat too much.
Ironically, this wonderful champion of free speech, this magazine, has long had ties with the French Communist Party. As a matter of fact, the editor who was killed, I think, was a lifetime member of the French Communist Party. So As we both know, these Stalinist parties are not really the best champions of speech anyway. So here's another irony for you.
Yeah, isn't it though? Well, exercising our free speech while we're still able to do so, Daniel, would like to also bring out another topic related to the French, to this Paris disaster. There is some reason to believe, apparently there's at least some reasons for questions about the possibility of another false flag. The kind of thing we've heard about so often throughout history. John Perkins has talked about it on my radio show. But what can you tell us about some allegations of false flags concerning this whole event in Paris?
Well, what's really interesting is on the Ron Paul Institute website, our editorial philosophy tends to be that we don't demand that we agree 100% with everything we put up. Mm-hmm. We believe in letting people decide. We believe in starting a debate. Obviously, we make editorial decisions about whether or not some things are not appropriate. Mm-hmm. But just because you put something up, just because you talk to someone on your show, Jay, doesn't mean you agree with them 100%.
No, that's for sure.
And every one of your guests, every single word they say, it cannot be attributed to you personally.
Right.
So what happened is a couple of days ago, we put up an article written by Paul Craig Roberts, who was an official in the Reagan administration. He was an editor of the Wall Street Journal, and he's a very contrarian writer. He has some very strong opinions. But he wrote an article questioning whether it was possible that this event was a false flag. And he made some very interesting points in the article. He pointed out some things, for example, how the chief investigator had mysteriously committed suicide right as he started his investigation. He pointed out that the so-called the accused attackers took such care in covering their faces, yet they were so careless to leave their ID in the getaway car. And so Paul Craig Roberts pointed these things out, and he didn't come to a definitive conclusion. He just said, this thing has kind of the markings of what you would expect in a false flag. And so I decided to put it up on the site because I think it's interesting to consider these things. I don't consider the CNN version of events or the New York Times or the White House version of historical events to be the definitive version. And I think it's a safe thing to do because we're consistently lied to mm-hmm. by all of the mainstream media and the government. But what happened, I was really not expecting. Of course, the neocons took this, who take any opportunity to attack Dr. Paul, as you well know.
Sure.
This gave them that opportunity they wanted, and so they did not. For example, the Weekly Standard ran a little blog post. Can you believe that the Ron Paul Institute believes it was a false flag? And it was. And even, sad to say, even some libertarian organizations and even some well-known libertarians themselves absolutely went haywire. Accusing the Institute, accusing Ron Paul of being incredibly irresponsible for even running this piece, So it was really kind of a wake up call in a way at how people, how they want to frame these issues and not allow any debate, even if like myself, I mean, I don't believe it was a false flag simply because I don't have any evidence that it was.
Yeah.
But am I willing to consider alternative views of what happened? Well, I think it's anti-intellectual to not be open to considering alternative views from the mainstream view.
Yeah, anti-intellectual and also very, very dangerous for our liberties because we've had plenty of evidence in the past of false flags and of American action and covert action to go in and unseat things, whether it's NGOs or the CIA itself, as John Perkins talked on my radio show about how it became a little too dangerous after the CIA went in and unseated the Iranian government. Then they had to start using NGOs to do that. And he talks about how he was very much a part of the NGO program to go in and get various governments entangled into our financial system so that we could actually own them. So there's so much covert stuff going on that very, very few people know anything about. And of course, years later, sometimes these things come out. But the mainstream will always try to defend itself. The status quo, by definition, tries to defend its rights of privilege, its ability to reallocate wealth by printing money and doing all kinds of things with it. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised by this. And yet the propaganda is so thorough that it has everybody is saying, "Oh, this could not happen," and Ron Paul is a nut. I mean, anybody that would suggest that President Obama would do anything devious and our government would ever do anything dishonest, well, how could they say that? Well,
or the French government or any other government. I mean, is it so preposterous to consider that the state would kill people, in an evil way? I mean, is it so preposterous? As one particularly astute commenter on our RPI Facebook site pointed out, false flags have occurred throughout history. The Boston Tea Party was a false flag. They dressed up like Indians and threw the tea in the harbor. So is it really so outrageous? And we're just finding out, to your point too, Jay, we're just finding out this past few years about Operation Gladio, which is this incredible thing that happened in the midst of the Cold War, where NATO special forces were blowing up things in Italy and killing a lot of innocent people to make it look like the communists had done it, to keep the Italians, firmly in NATO's realm.
Wow!
This is not conspiracy theory. This has all come out.
Yeah.
So
maybe it's come out, Daniel, but it certainly wasn't headline news on ABC Nightly News.
Yeah, but it's also on very mainstream sites. You'll see plenty written about Operation Gladio. So this is not that long ago that governments have done things like this. Does that mean I think this was? Not necessarily, but I'm interested in reading. If someone like Paul Craig Roberts writes about it, I want to read what he has to say and make my own mind up. I'm not going to let Wolf Blitzer decide for me.
Right. No, for sure. Absolutely. Well, this was the whole idea of freedom of speech, was to safeguard the abuses of our government. That was one of the ideas. The same reason that we were allowed to own guns to safeguard ourselves against against government's tyranny. So, in any event, our founding fathers understood that government could be the biggest problem, not the biggest savior, not a savior at all, but the biggest threat to our lives. Well, speaking of governments that are threats to our lives, just maybe in the last couple of minutes here, if you could talk about the Ukraine. I see there's headlines on the Ron Paul Institute site. It says, civilian bus attacked in Ukraine, Washington blames the rebels. Is there is this a pretty straightforward thing, that it was these bad guys that want liberty and freedom and don't want to be taken over by the NATO forces, these bad guys that wouldn't submit to NATO, that they and Putin is to blame again? Is that what this is all about?
Well, that's certainly how the U.S. framed it, and U.S. State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf, really almost right after the event happened, came out and said this is yet another example of these horrible Russian-backed forces. And this is before anyone, including the OSCE monitors who were on the ground there, before any of them had made any determination as to what had happened, who might have done it, what might have been the motivation. None of them had any evidence, but here the White House once again, and this is a pattern.
Yeah, it's a pattern.
U.S. administrations, look at this whole thing about North Korea hacking Sony.
Right.
And I think we talked about this not long ago too, Jay, that all of these top cybersecurity firms went to the White House and said, look, your evidence is really flimsy.
Right.
But they stuck by it.
For sure.
The shooting of the airline, the U.S. was sure that Russia did it. So it's on and on and on.
Before anybody had any chance to do any investigations, it was as soon as the news came out that the plane went down, it was already figured what the cause was. I mean, normally it takes a long time to figure out what takes planes down. Yeah, there's a lot of research and a lot of effort and a lot of work that goes into investigating these things. But within minutes, we knew.
Yeah, propaganda is all about framing the issue. Nobody looks at the corrections that have to be made, months down the road. And so this is a classic example. And what this means, though, it pushes this civil war closer to reigniting, and I think it's very close. There was some severe firefights by the airport in Donetsk over the past few days, and a lot of shelling. And I think it's about ready to be ginned up again. And, part of the reason we talked about this at the time, Jay, is at the end of the year, Congress passed and the president signed the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, which basically encourages the government that the Washington backs in Kiev, encourages them to go after these guys in the East who want to have their independence, and promises them a bunch of weapons and money to do it. So I think that's what we're seeing the beginning of right now, and it remains extremely dangerous.
Yeah, well, now we have Republicans holding both houses is probably likely to to be even more aggressive in terms of our foreign policy, military actions, huh? That's your read of it, Daniel?
I think that's a safe bet, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, all these flag-waving, wonderful, liberty-loving, in my day it was kill a commie for Christ. Now I guess it's, kill a Muslim for Christ. I don't know. It's the whole idea would certainly have the founders of our country rolling over in their graves for sure if they were here to see what's going on today. I think. Anything else yet, Daniel, you might like to add before we complete our discussion this week?
Sure. Well, the administration announced today that it was going to send 400 American soldiers to the Middle East to start training Syrian rebels. It's going to train 5,000 Syrian rebels. And, of course, we found out recently that 3,000 of our moderate rebels from the Free Syrian Army have recently gone over to ISIS. So we're going to train these guys, and a lot of them are going to end up in ISIS for sure. We're basically training the same kind of guys that carried out the attack in Paris. So how's that for an insane foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny. It would be hilarious. But it is actually. But we've seen this time and time and time again. What country that we've gone into, all of the Arab Spring revolutions that took place were supposed to be such a great thing for liberty, and we find out there's less liberty than ever before. And if anybody is really being persecuted and being hurt the worst, it's the Christians in those countries, it seems, for the most part.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to that. Absolutely, Jay.
Yeah. Well, so they're training the Syrian rebels, so it's a constant war, and I guess from a bigger picture, it's probably also part of the bigger geopolitical puzzle as well, right? With Russia on the other side, Russia and China, perhaps.
Yeah, that certainly is a factor. That's absolutely a factor. The U.S., I'm sure, would like to see Russia's base its naval base in Syria shut down, and that will certainly be probably the first move if they win this war. But I'll tell you, there's going to be thousands and thousands more killed if the U.S. tries to ramp up its plans to overthrow Assad in Syria.
It's just more chaos everywhere you turn. Every time we ratchet it up, we have more chaos and more destruction and more.
And then they say, why do they hate us?
Yeah.
Why did they hate us?
I can't imagine why they would hate us. We're such good people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tragic, and I don't know why this is going on, Daniel. I don't have an explanation for why we continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, except that, as somebody once said, that's the definition of insanity, to continue doing the same thing over and over again and expect the same results. And we see it in the monetary policy with what the United States is doing and all the central banks around the world. And it all is leading to more chaos in the economy, but it's the same thing seeming to be going on in the geopolitical realm as well. Well, any more thoughts, Daniel?
I think that about covers it in our time limit, Jay.
Yeah. Well, these are some very big, very important topics, and I want to thank you again, Daniel, for sharing them with our listeners. It's really great to talk to you. We'll look to do it again next week.
Thanks so much.